expertise. But right now, here's the president.
My fellow Americans, tonight I am speaking to you because there is a growing humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border. Every day, Customs and Border Patrol agents encounter thousands of illegal immigrants trying to enter our country. We are out of space to hold them, and we have no way to promptly return them back home to their country. America proudly welcomes millions of lawful immigrants who enrich our society and contribute to our nation. But all Americans are hurt by uncontrolled illegal migration. It strains public resources and drives down jobs and wages. Among those hardest hit are African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. In the last 2 years, ICE officers made 266,000 arrests of aliens with criminal records, including those charged or convicted of 100,000 assaults, 30,000 sex crimes, and 4,000 violent killings. Over the years, thousands of Americans have been brutally killed by those who illegally entered our country, and thousands more lives will be lost if we don't act right now. This is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the heart and a crisis of the soul. Last month, 20,000 migrant children were illegally brought into the United States, a dramatic increase. These children are used as human pawns by vicious coyotes and ruthless gangs. 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted on the dangerous trek up through Mexico. Women or children are the biggest victims, by far, of our broken system. This is the tragic reality of illegal immigration on our southern border. This is the cycle of human suffering that I am determined to end. My administration has presented Congress with a detailed proposal to secure the border and stop the criminal gangs, drug smugglers, and human traffickers. It's a tremendous problem. Our proposal was developed by law enforcement professionals and border agents at the Department of Homeland Security. These are the resources they have requested to properly perform their mission and keep America safe, in fact, safer than ever before. The proposal from Homeland Security includes cutting-edge technology for detecting drugs, weapons, illegal contraband, and many other things. We have requested more agents, immigration judges, and bed space to process the sharp rise in unlawful migration fueled by our very strong economy. Our plan also contains an urgent request for humanitarian assistance and medical support. Furthermore, we have asked Congress to close border security loopholes so that illegal immigrant children can be safely and humanely returned back home. Finally, as part of an overall approach to border security, law enforcement professionals have requested $5.7 billion for a physical barrier. At the request of Democrats, it will be a steel barrier rather than a concrete wall. This barrier is absolutely critical to border security. It's also what our professionals at the border want and need. This is just common sense. The border wall would very quickly pay for itself. The cost of illegal drugs exceeds $500 billion a year, vastly more than the $5.7 billion we have requested from Congress. The wall will also be paid for indirectly by the great new trade deal we have made with Mexico. Senator Chuck Schumer, who you will be hearing from later tonight, has repeatedly supported a physical barrier in the past, along with many other Democrats. They changed their mind only after I was elected president. Democrats in Congress have refused to acknowledge the crisis, and they have refused to provide our brave border agents with the tools they desperately need to protect our families and our nation. The federal government remains shut down for one reason, and one reason only, because Democrats will not fund border security. My administration is doing everything in our power to help those impacted by the situation. But the only solution is for Democrats to pass a spending bill that defends our borders and reopens the government. This situation could be solved in a 45-minute meeting. I have invited congressional leadership to the White House tomorrow to get this done. Hopefully, we can rise above partisan politics in order to support national security. Some have suggested a barrier is immoral. Then why do wealthy politicians build walls, fences, and gates around their homes? They don't build walls because they hate the people on the outside, but because they love the people on the inside. The only thing that is immoral is the politicians to do nothing and continue to allow more innocent people to be so horribly victimized. America's heart broke the day after Christmas when a young police officer in California was savagely murdered in cold blood by an illegal alien who just came across the border. The life of an American hero was stolen by someone who had no right to be in our country. Day after day, precious lives are cut short by those who have violated our borders. In California, an Air Force veteran was raped, murdered, and beaten to death with a hammer by an illegal alien with a long criminal history. In Georgia, an illegal alien was recently charged with murder for killing, beheading, and dismembering his neighbor. In Maryland, MS-13 gang members who arrived in the United States as unaccompanied minors were arrested and charged last year after viciously stabbing and beating a 16-year-old girl. Over the last several years, I've met with dozens of families whose loved ones were stolen by illegal immigration. I've held the hands of the weeping mothers and embraced the grief-stricken fathers. So sad, so terrible. I will never forget the pain in their eyes, the tremble in their voices, and the sadness gripping their souls. How much more American blood must we shed before Congress does its job? To those who refuse to compromise in the name of border security, I would ask, imagine if it was your child, your husband, or your wife whose life was so cruelly shattered and totally broken. To every member of Congress, pass a bill that ends this crisis. To every citizen, call Congress and tell them to finally, after all of these decades, secure our border. This is a choice between right and wrong, justice and injustice. This is about whether we fulfill our sacred duty to the American citizens we serve. When I took the oath of office, I swore to protect our country, and that is what I will always do. So help me God. Thank you and good night.
President Trump live from the Oval Office with about an 8 or 9 minute address, as promised, making arguments that have become quite familiar in his support for a wall, or as he now says, a steel barrier on the southern border. The president repeating some of the dubious claims he's made in the past. including the idea that Mexico would indirectly pay for the construction of a wall through a trade deal that has not been ratified and contains no language that would suggest that kind of funding. The president also making an economic argument and an argument about crime. Let's bring in right now Meet the Press moderator Chuck Todd in Washington. Chuck, what did you pick up?
Well, what was intriguing to me is how much it lacked any new information in some ways. It actually reminded me he gave a more formalized version of really what the stump speech he used in the last month of the campaign, when he was trying to make the case that there was a crisis at the border, when he was trying to use the fear of crime. He used various phrases like he did tonight, you know, how much more blood has to be shed. He really would try to put it in very visual, stark terms. And as we now know, that had no impact there. So I am a bit surprised that this speech is just essentially a rewritten version of that stump speech. But without the sort of the fiery rhetoric. And then it was, I would say, probably the most, he made a lot of dubious claims. One of the more dubious on the political front was the claim that he made about when he said, and finally I want a physical barrier. And at the request of the Democrats, it's no longer a concrete wall, it's steel. I don't know how many Democrats would line up and say, oh yes, no. They said, sure, have your wall as long as it's steel and not concrete. Some of this back and forth, Lester, is about semantics, right? Some of this is about, the irony here is what the president outlined. Democrats would support 90% of what he outlined. It's just simply that physical barrier part where is the sticking point. And I think that's where we're stuck. We're stuck on semantics.
We're a few minutes away from the Democratic response, but let me bring in our chief White House correspondent, Hallie Jackson, who's been watching this with us. Hallie, a few weeks ago, the president said he would proudly own a government shutdown. He would take it, that he wouldn't blame Democrats. Then he came along and said, you can call it the Trump shutdown, you can call it the Pelosi shutdown. Tonight, he was laying it squarely at the feet of Democrats. What's the thinking there?
And he was putting it in very stark terms, Lester. This is about right and wrong, justice versus injustice. This is about the president trying to make his case. And to Chuck's point there, probably the newest part about this speech was the setting. It was the president in the Oval Office using that presidential pulpit to deliver a message directly to the American people. This is about a PR push for the president to try to sell his thinking and his strategy behind this shutdown. You'll hear Democrats make the counterargument.
All right, Hallie, thank you. As we mentioned, you are going to hear now the Democratic response to the president's remarks delivered from the Capitol Hill by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. It's unusual that a presidential speech other than a State of the Union would get a formal response like this, but these are unusual circumstances. Here now the Democrats.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak directly to the American people tonight about how we can end this shutdown and meet the needs of the American people. Sadly, much of what we heard from President Trump throughout this senseless shutdown has been full of misinformation and even malice. The president has chosen fear. We want to start with the facts. The fact is, on the very first day of this Congress, House Democrats passed Senate Republican legislation to reopen government and fund smart, effective border security solutions. But the president is rejecting these bipartisan bills which would reopen government over his obsession with forcing American taxpayers to waste billions of dollars on an expensive and ineffective wall, a wall he always promised Mexico would pay for. The fact is, President Trump has chosen to hold hostage critical services for the health, safety, and well-being of the American people and withhold the paychecks of 800,000 innocent workers across the nation, many of them veterans. He promised to keep government shut down for months or years, no matter whom it hurts. That's just plain wrong. The fact is, we all agree we need to secure our borders while honoring our values. We can build the infrastructure and roads at our ports of entry. We can install new technology to scan cars and trucks for drugs coming into our nation. We can hire the personnel we need to facilitate trade and immigration at the border. We can fund more innovation to detect unauthorized crossings. The fact is, the women and children at the border are not a security threat. They are a humanitarian challenge, a challenge that President Trump's own cruel and counterproductive policies have only deepened. And the fact is, President Trump must stop holding the American people hostage, must stop manufacturing a crisis, must reopen the government. Thank you. Leader Schumer.
Thank you, Speaker Pelosi. My fellow Americans, we address you tonight for one reason only. The President of the United States, having failed to get Mexico to pay for his ineffective, unnecessary border wall, and unable to convince the Congress or the American people to foot the bill, has shut down the government. American democracy doesn't work that way. We don't govern by temper tantrum. No president should pound the table and demand he gets his way, or else the government shuts down, hurting millions of Americans who are treated as leverage. Tonight, and throughout this debate and throughout his presidency, President Trump has appealed to fear, not facts, division, not unity. Make no mistake, Democrats and the president both want stronger border security. However, we sharply disagree with the president about the most effective way to do it. So, how do we untangle this mess? Well, there's an obvious solution. Separate the shutdown from arguments over border security. There is bipartisan legislation supported by Democrats and Republicans to reopen government while allowing debate over border security to continue. There is no excuse for hurting millions of Americans over a policy difference. Federal workers are about to miss a paycheck. Some families can't get a mortgage to buy a new home. Farmers and small businesses won't get loans they desperately need. Most presidents have used Oval Office addresses for noble purposes. This president just used the backdrop of the Oval Office to manufacture a crisis, stoke fear, and divert attention from the turmoil in his administration. My fellow Americans, there is no challenge so great that our nation cannot rise to meet it. We can reopen the government and continue to work through disagreements over policy. We can secure our border without an ineffective, expensive wall. And we can welcome legal immigrants and refugees without compromising safety and security. The symbol of America should be the Statue of Liberty, not a 30-foot wall. So our suggestion is a simple one. Mr. President, reopen the government and we can work to resolve our differences over border security, but end this shutdown now. Thank you.
That the Democrats' response to the president's remarks. They also not turning over a lot of new territory here, the same arguments we've been hearing from the Democratic side. Let me bring in Casey Hunt. She's been following all this closely and joins us from Capitol Hill. Senator Schumer noted this idea of separating out the shutdown, those issues that they can agree on, from the wall. Is that showing any cracks among Republicans? Are they getting support on that from Republicans?
Lester, good evening. There are some Republicans who have suggested that this is an approach that they would support, particularly some Republicans in the Senate who, come from swing states where opinion on this is not necessarily in line with what the president believes. There are also a number of Republicans in the House that we expect might vote with the approach that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi just laid out there to open up pieces of the government one at a time. But the reality is there probably aren't enough of them to make a veto-proof majority to override this president. That's simply not something that seems realistic, according to all of my sources that I've talked to on Capitol Hill. And the reality from listening to both of these addresses tonight, the view from here, this seems to just escalate this standoff. There's really no end in sight to it. The president clearly digging in. Democrats have no incentive to give him what he wants. The government has been funded several times since this president has been in office without this wall. He has decided that this is going to be his last stand. And Lester, tonight it just doesn't seem as though we are any closer to a resolution here.
Yeah, he didn't seem to offer anything that would bring comfort to those 800,000 workers and their families who will likely miss a check this Friday. Thank you, Casey. One of the many headlines of the president's remarks will be his doubling down on the issue of security and crime, despite the fact there's no evidence suggesting that immigrants create any more crime than native-born Americans. Let's hear what the president had to say about that.
Our southern border is a pipeline for vast quantities of illegal drugs, including meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl. Every week, 300 of our citizens are killed by heroin alone, 90% of which floods across from our southern border. More Americans will die from drugs this year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War.
NBC's Gabe Gutierrez has been reporting from the U.S.-Mexico border. He joins us tonight from El Paso, Texas. What's the reality on the ground here of the drug flow across the border?
Hi, Lester. Good evening. Well, the DEA has said that the vast majority of drugs coming into the U.S. actually come through legal ports of entry, either smugglers taking them in passenger vans or tractor trailers. So critics here on the border say that a wall really wouldn't help any of that. The president also referenced MS-13, something he's done repeatedly as president and also as a candidate, that notorious gang from Central America. And while ICE did make 181,000 arrests last year, less than 3% of them were gang-related, and a small fraction of that were MS-13 related. Now, it is important to point out, from speaking with people here at the border, the president does have many supporters here who do thank him for taking a stand when it comes to this wall. However, we've spoken with many others, advocates, who say that this is a manufactured crisis. Now, the question will be is how, what becomes of this here on the border. We've spoken with several agents here, and as well as federal employees, including one who I just spoke with, who says that this government shutdown is really causing a huge problem for the federal employees here at the border. And while Customs and Border Protection agents do want better security here at the border, this should not be done on the backs of federal workers. Now, Lester, 400,000 apprehensions were made in the southwest border during the last fiscal year, but that is dramatically less than the 1.6 million that were made back in the year 2000. Lester.
Gabe Gutierrez on the southern border for us tonight. Let me bring back Chuck Todd very quickly. Chuck, I'm scratching my head here trying to figure out who the intended audience was that the president really wanted to reach today.
Well, look, it's pretty clear, and as you know, he hosted a bunch of us that were here in Washington for an off-the-record conversation about previewing tonight's speech. It was pretty clear for me coming away from that without violating the off-the-record that tonight was about, the audience was one group of folks, and it was congressional Republicans. They were looking for the air cover. They were looking for the support. They're the ones that believe the president has mismanaged the messaging on this. Tonight was an attempt to try to get back on top of this, try to reassure these wavering Republicans in Capitol Hill that Casey was talking to you about from bailing on him. He's going to have a meeting with them tomorrow and those Senate Republicans. But I have to tell you, I didn't hear anything tonight that in my mind would somehow reassure wobbly Republicans that they should stick by him on this tomorrow. We'll see if he has any better luck.
In the few seconds we have left, any indication that he would stick to this idea of declaring an emergency and going alone?
I think he may always keep it out there, and he may even attempt to do it if he has to, quote, cave and open the government without getting his wall. He can still hold that out there and maybe even fight it in the courts, declare it, fight it in the courts, but then that politically that might help keep his base. I think it's still his final exit ramp out of this political mess that he's put himself in.
All right, Chuck Todd, thank you. That concludes tonight's live coverage. We're returning you now to our previously scheduled programming. We'll continue to follow all this on MSNBC and on NBCnews.com. For now, I'm Lester Holt, NBC News, New York. Good night, everyone.